I'm still alive, but my family buried me in a coffin. Not by mistake, not in panic, not because a doctor was wrong. They buried me because I was worth more dead than alive. At 2:14 a.m., a man in a white coat wrote my name on a line and drew a single word beside it, deceased. At 2:20, paperwork began moving. By sunrise, my bank accounts were being reviewed, my company was being reassigned, and my life insurance, $4.7 million, was no longer theoretical. By evening, I was underground, listening to dirt-hit wood while my heart was still beating. This isn't a ghost story. This isn't horror. This is what happens when money, power, and silence agree with each other. I was 52 years old. I owned a business valued just under $9 million. I had a wife who asked too many questions, a brother who waited too patiently, and adult women in my house who listened when numbers were discussed, not out of curiosity, but strategy. What you're about to hear is not about death. It's about what people become when your existence interferes with their future. If you've ever trusted family, if you've ever believed money doesn't change people, if you've ever assumed betrayal announces itself loudly, stay with me. Because the coffin wasn't the end of my story, it was the moment I finally understood it. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel. These stories don't scream. They whisper, and they're all true in the ways that matter. If this story makes you uncomfortable, like the video, it tells the algorithm this truth deserves to be heard. And as you listen, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Now let me tell you what it feels like to hear your own funeral begin, while you're still alive inside the box. I was sitting alone in my study when the pain started, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly, but instead creeps in like a quiet decision already made. The clock on the wall said 1:47 a.m. The house was silent in that expensive, echoing way silence only exists in homes built with money and distance. My family was asleep upstairs, or at least that's what I believed then. I remember thinking about numbers the way I often did late at night. Numbers calm me. 52 years old. 27 years in business. A company valued just under $9 million on paper. Liquid assets a little over $2 million. Insurance policies spread across 3 institutions, totaling $4.7 million. I remember thinking I still had time to fix things. I remember being wrong. The pain hit harder when I stood up. My legs gave out, and I remembered the floor feeling colder than it should have. I tried to call out, but my voice came out thin, embarrassed, like it didn't want to disturb anyone. The last thing I clearly remember before the darkness closed in was the sound of footsteps. Not rushed, not panicked, measured, calm, as if someone had been expecting this moment. When I woke up again, everything felt heavy. Not painful, heavy. My chest didn't rise the way it should have. The air smelled wrong, earthy, old, damp. I tried to move my hands and realized I couldn't. Panic came next, sharp and immediate, but even panic felt muted, like my body had already accepted a conclusion my mind hadn't reached yet. I tried to open my eyes fully, but darkness pressed back. Not the soft darkness of a room with lights off. This was absolute, enclosed, close. That was when I heard the first sound, dirt, not falling fast, being placed, carefully. A dull thud. Then another. Someone spoke above me, but I couldn't make out the words. The sound traveled strangely, like it was being filtered through layers of wood and soil. My heart started to race, and I tried to scream. Nothing came out. My throat burned. My lungs begged. That's when I understood something terrifying. I wasn't dead. But someone had decided I was. Later, I would learn that the doctor pronounced me deceased at 2:14 a.m., acute cardiac failure. They wrote, clean, convenient, no autopsy requested, no questions asked. At 2:20 a.m., paperwork began moving. Power of attorney activated. Accounts flagged. At 6 a.m., calls were made. By noon, condolences were being received. And by evening, my body, my still breathing body, was on its way into the ground. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I was inside a coffin, buried deep enough that the pressure on my chest felt like a decision I could no longer argue with. I focused on counting seconds, heartbeats, anything to keep my mind from fracturing. My business instincts kicked in absurdly. Inventory the situation, assess risk, calculate survival time. I remembered reading somewhere that panic eats oxygen faster than fear. I forced myself to slow my breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, shallow, controlled, 30 minutes, maybe less. As I lay there, memories came in fragments. Conversations from the past year replayed differently now, rearranging themselves into something darker. My wife's sudden interest in the company accounts, her questions about beneficiaries, the way my brother had insisted on being added as a co-signer just in case. The adult girls, not children, never children, who sat at my table and listened too carefully when money was discussed. The way silence would fall whenever I entered a room unexpectedly. I had planned to change the will. That part matters. 3 weeks before that night, I'd sat with my lawyer and told him to prepare revisions. Shares reallocated. Insurance beneficiaries adjusted. A trust restructured. I hadn't signed yet. I wanted time. I thought time was something I still controlled. The documents were drafted, sitting in a folder labeled simply Update. Someone knew about that folder. Someone knew what it meant. Another thud of dirt hit the lid above me. Heavier this time. Final. The realization settled in slowly, far more terrifying than the initial panic. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a medical mistake. This was efficient, quiet, almost respectful. No shouting, no rush, no hesitation. Just a process being completed. I tried to remember faces. Who stood closest to the coffin? Who avoided looking down? Who signed first? I imagined them standing there in dark clothes, expressions carefully chosen. I imagined the numbers already moving from one column to another, from my name to theirs. 4.7 million divided neatly by loyalty and silence. My vision began to blur, not because of tears, but because my body was losing the argument with oxygen. My fingers tingled, my thoughts slowed. In that moment, something strange happened. I stopped feeling afraid. What I felt instead was clarity. Money doesn't make people cruel. It reveals what they were willing to become all along. As the darkness pressed closer, one final thought burned through everything else, sharp and undeniable. They didn't bury me because they thought I was dead. They buried me because it was profitable. And above me, as the last of the dirt settled into place, my family began mourning a man who was still very much alive. By the time the first shovelful of dirt sealed the lid above me, the machinery of money was already in motion, moving with a speed and confidence that told me this moment had been rehearsed long before my chest ever tightened on that floor. Because while I was underground, counting shallow breaths and measuring seconds like currency, upstairs and across town and inside offices with clean desks and warm lights, my name was being erased line by line, account by account, signature by signature, the way a company dissolves a failed division without emotion. And I understood it all with horrifying clarity because this was the language I had spoken my entire adult life, the language of leverage and timing and plausible deniability. And I knew exactly how it worked. The insurance provider notified at dawn. The phrase, unexpected but peaceful, repeated just enough times to sound natural. The doctor's report accepted without resistance, because no one demanded more. The bank receiving instructions to freeze, and then reassign operational authority under an emergency clause I myself had approved years earlier when I believed trust was the same thing as safety. And it was almost elegant how smoothly it happened, how the system welcomed their certainty, how no one questioned why a man with no terminal history died conveniently before signing a revised will, because money prefers confidence, and my family was confident. Confident enough to start dividing before the ground above me had settled. Confident enough to sit at tables and discuss percentages with lowered voices. Confident enough for my wife to ask about the primary policy first, not the smallest one, but the $4.7 million coverage tied to my name like a final reward. Confident enough for my brother to step into my office chair and open the company ledger like he had always belonged there. Confident enough for the adult women who circled my life like satellites, never children, always old enough to understand consequences, to suddenly speak up in meetings they had once listened through in silence, suggesting restructures, asset sales, quiet liquidations, turning my life's work into numbers they could move cleanly without sentiment. And it struck me then, lying there beneath layers of soil and wood, that death wasn't the end they were waiting for. It was the permission, the legal switch that transformed concern into ownership, grief into authority, affection into access. And I realized that the real burial hadn't happened in the ground, but in the paperwork. In the moment my signature became unnecessary, because I had built something valuable enough that my absence was worth more than my presence. And that knowledge settled heavier than the dirt, heavier than the coffin lid, because betrayal isn't loud when it's profitable, it's quiet, methodical, and polite. And as my breath grew shorter and my thoughts slowed, I could almost hear the sound of calculators tapping, phones vibrating with confirmations, balances updating, as if the world above me had already decided that I was finished, that my story was closed, that my value had been fully converted into figures neat enough to divide. And in that suffocating darkness, with my heart still beating uselessly for people who had already moved on, I understood something far worse than panic or fear. I understood that my family didn't panic when I collapsed. They prepared, and preparation means forethought, and forethought means intent. The coffin itself wasn't the worst part, not at first, because wood and darkness are tangible enemies, and I had spent my life fighting tangible things, contracts, competitors, deadlines, losses you could measure and explain. But what began to break me was time, the way it stretched and warped underground, until minutes felt like negotiations with no end, because every breath became a decision, and every decision felt like a gamble I couldn't afford to lose. And I remember thinking how absurd it was that after decades of building leverage and contingency plans and financial buffers, my survival now depended on whether I could keep my chest still enough to save a few molecules of air. And I focused on discipline the way I always had, slowing my heart, forcing calm, reminding myself that panic was expensive and control was currency. But my body didn't care about philosophy. It cared about oxygen. And as the minutes crawled forward, my lungs began to burn with a dull, spreading ache that made concentration feel like lifting weights with thoughts instead of muscles. And that's when the memories stopped coming in fragments and started coming in patterns, revealing things I hadn't wanted to see when I was above ground, like how the conversations over the last year had shifted from curiosity to calculation, how questions about my health had arrived too neatly, too regularly, how the concern in their voices never reached their eyes, how meetings happened without me more often, how decisions were framed as help when they were really rehearsals. And lying there, immobile and invisible, I finally understood how isolation works. Not the dramatic kind where someone locks you away, but the quiet kind where you are slowly removed from relevance, where your authority is softened, your presence tolerated, your absence prepared for, because by the time the coffin lid closed above me, I had already been buried socially, strategically, emotionally, and that realization was suffocating in a way the dirt never could be, because it meant that even if I screamed loud enough to be heard, there was no one above who would rush to save me, only people who would pause, exchange looks, and decide whether saving me was still worth the trouble. And as my body grew heavier and my thoughts began slipping like sand through fingers, I felt something colder than fear settle in, a kind of resignation sharpened by clarity, the understanding that this wasn't a moment of chaos, but the final step of a plan, that my collapse had been anticipated, my survival discounted, my silence assumed, and the cruelest part was knowing that the world above me wasn't holding its breath the way I was. It was exhaling, relieved, already moving forward, already rewriting my role in their story from problem to solution, while I lay there in the dark, realizing that the coffin wasn't meant to kill me quickly. It was meant to make my disappearance neat, unquestioned, and profitable. What finally shattered the last illusion I had about accident or misunderstanding was not pain or panic, but the slow, unbearable awareness that someone above ground had made a choice while I was still breathing. Because plans like this don't rely on certainty, they rely on probability, and probability had been enough for them to move forward, enough for them to accept the risk that I might not be fully gone yet, and that realization crept into me with a cold precision as my thoughts drifted in and out, because I remembered the exact clauses, the emergency provisions I had approved years earlier, when the company first crossed 7 figures, clauses designed to protect continuity, to prevent chaos if something happened to me, clauses that transferred authority not after confirmation but after declaration, and I understood then how dangerously simple it was to declare a man finished if enough people benefited from believing it, because above me signatures were being placed with steady hands, witnesses nodding along, lawyers speaking softly about timelines and compliance, all of it wrapped in professionalism so clean it felt almost moral. And I saw my family not as villains, but as executives making a hard decision, weighing outcomes, balancing risk, choosing profit over uncertainty, because in their calculations my survival had become a liability, a loose end that threatened to undo the clean transfer of money, power, and reputation they had already begun to enjoy. And I could almost hear the conversations unfolding in rooms I once controlled. My wife insisting that everything had been done properly. My brother reminding everyone how fragile I had looked recently, how stress had aged me, how no one could have predicted this, and the adult women whose opinions suddenly mattered speaking with rehearsed sympathy, framing my death as tragic but timely, necessary even, for stability, for the business, for the family. And in that suffocating darkness, it became horrifyingly clear that the scandal wasn't that I had been buried alive. The scandal was that my life had been weighed against money and found inconvenient, that my breathing had been considered a technicality rather than a truth. And as my body weakened and my consciousness flickered like a failing signal, I understood that what they were really burying wasn't me. It was risk, because a dead man can't challenge signatures, can't reverse transfers, can't expose intentions, and the moment they accepted that logic, the moment they decided silence was cheaper than mercy, the coffin became nothing more than a formality, the final seal on a transaction already approved. And as that truth settled in, heavier than earth, heavier than wood, I realized that even if I survived, nothing above ground would ever be the same, because the people mourning me had already shown exactly how much my life was worth once it interfered with their plans. I don't remember the exact moment my body decided not to die, only the slow, humiliating return of sensation, the way pain crept back in stages as if testing whether I was worth the effort. Because survival wasn't heroic or dramatic, it was mechanical and ugly, driven by reflex rather than hope. And when air finally reached me again, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like an intrusion, like something I hadn't earned, and long after I was no longer underground, I kept thinking about how close they had come to being right, how thin the margin was between a profitable death and an inconvenient survival, because coming back didn't feel like winning. It felt like waking up in a world where the rules had quietly changed while I was gone, a world where my name had already been closed out, my authority reassigned, my absence normalized, and I learned very quickly that returning alive is not the same as returning whole, because people don't panic when a dead man reappears, they recalibrate, they smile too carefully, they ask too many questions framed as concern, and they watch you closely to see whether you remember what you're entitled to. And I did remember, but what I remembered most vividly was the stillness of that coffin, the calm efficiency with which I had been erased, and it rewired something in me permanently, stripping away the last illusions I had about loyalty and blood and shared history. Because once you understand that people can accept your death as a logistical advantage, You stop seeing the world as a place of relationships and start seeing it as a system of incentives. And in that system, I no longer wanted forgiveness or explanations or apologies. I wanted distance, silence, leverage. Because survival doesn't automatically give you justice, it gives you information. And information is far more dangerous. So I let them believe what they needed to believe for a little while longer. That I was weak, confused, grateful. Because I had learned underground that the most powerful position is not the one where you scream the truth, but the one where you understand exactly how far people were willing to go when they thought you were no longer a problem. And as I stood back in the world, breathing air that felt undeserved, watching my family move carefully around me like accountants around a volatile asset, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The man they buried was never coming back, and the man who survived was done trusting anything that required a coffin to prove its value.